If you haven't listed your property yet, this video might be the most valuable thing you watch before you do anything else, because what I'm about to walk you through is something most sellers only learn after they've already gone through the traditional process, watched it fail, and then had to start over from a more difficult position than the one they started in. I'd rather you understand it before that happens. Here's the assumption most sellers make when they first decide they're ready to sell. They assume the traditional process: find a real estate agent, list the property, find a buyer, close, is the default path, the standard option, the thing you try first because it works most of the time. And for a specific type of property with a specific type of seller in a specific type of situation, that's true. The traditional process works well. It was designed well. It has been refined over decades to move a particular kind of transaction efficiently. The problem is that it was designed for a particular kind of transaction, and if your situation doesn't match the design, the process doesn't bend to fit you. It just fails. Let me explain exactly what the traditional process was built for, so you can see clearly whether your situation fits it. The traditional process assumes the property is in a condition that a conventional lender will approve. This isn't a loose standard. Conventional lenders have specific requirements. The property needs to meet minimum condition thresholds. Certain repairs are not optional. Certain issues are automatic disqualifiers. If the property doesn't pass, the buyer loses their financing and the deal collapses. Not because anything went wrong in the negotiation, because the process hit a structural wall it was never designed to get around. The traditional process also assumes the buyer is financing the purchase through a bank. That means the bank is a third party to the transaction with its own requirements, its own timeline, and its own reasons to say no at any point in the process. You can negotiate a price, sign a contract, wait 30 to 60 days through inspections and appraisals and underwriting, and then watch the deal fall apart at the last stage because the bank made a decision that had nothing to do with you or the buyer. It assumes the title is clean. Any complexity on the title, liens, outstanding obligations, anything that complicates the chain of ownership has to be resolved before closing. In some cases, that's straightforward. In other cases, it becomes its own separate process with its own timeline and its own costs. And it assumes you have the time that process requires. The average traditional sale takes 60 to 90 days from accepted offer to close when it goes smoothly. When it doesn't go smoothly, it takes longer, or it doesn't close at all. Now look at your situation against those assumptions. If you inherited this property, there's a reasonable chance it needs work. Not necessarily major work, but the kind of deferred maintenance that accumulates when a property has been lived in for decades by someone who was managing on a fixed income or who had other priorities in their final years. A conventional lender may or may not approve it in that condition. You won't know until you're already in the process. If the property has been sitting, every month it sits increases the likelihood that something new needs attention. The roof, the HVAC, the plumbing. A property that might have qualified 6 months ago may not qualify today. If there's any financial complexity attached, and for a significant number of the sellers watching this, there is that complexity doesn't disappear when you list the property. It waits. And it surfaces at exactly the wrong moment when a buyer is already under contract and a closing date is already on the calendar. Here's what I want you to understand about what happens when you walk a situation like that into the traditional process. You don't find out it won't work at the beginning. You find out at the end. You find an agent. You sign a listing agreement. You put the property on the market. You wait. Maybe you get an offer. Maybe you negotiate. Maybe you get to contract. And then somewhere in the 30 to 60 days between contract and closing, one of those assumptions I described hits a wall. The inspection surfaces something the lender won't approve. The appraisal comes in below the agreed price. Something on the title needs to be resolved and there isn't time. The buyer walks and now you're back to the beginning, except you're not actually back to the beginning, you're behind it because the listing history is public. A property that went under contract and fell through signals something to the next buyer before they've even seen it. The carrying costs kept running during the months you were in process, and whatever was underneath the situation when you started is still there, now with more time on it. That's the hidden cost of trying the traditional process on a situation it wasn't built for. It's not just that it fails, it's that it fails late, after you've already invested time and hope and energy into it. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I'm not telling you the traditional process is bad. It isn't. For a property that meets the requirements, good condition, clean title, flexible timeline, no financial complexity underneath, it's a perfectly functional path. There are sellers for whom listing with an agent is exactly the right move. What I'm telling you is that the traditional process has a profile. And if your situation doesn't match that profile, the process will not adapt to you. It will run its course and then tell you no. The question worth asking before you invest months in finding that out is whether your situation matches the profile. Most of the sellers watching this are in a situation that has at least one of the following: a property that needs work, a timeline that matters, financial complexity underneath, or some combination of all three. If that's you, and you haven't gone through the traditional process yet, the most valuable thing you can do right now is understand what process was actually built for your situation before you put yourself through one that wasn't. That's not a reason to panic. It's a reason to ask a different question than the one most sellers start with. Most sellers start with, how do I sell this property? The better question, the one that actually leads somewhere useful, is, what process was built for a situation like mine? Those are different questions, and they lead to very different paths. The next video gets into exactly that, what your real options actually are based on the situation you're actually in, not in general terms, specifically. If you've watched this far, you're already thinking about this more clearly than most sellers do before they take their first step. Stay with us.